go over something, anytime that I'm going over something today, feel free to stop me, ask me questions, okay? Because I'm going over all this to kind of give you guys a sense as far as how do we analyze this stuff? How do we analyze film? How do we I want to really teach you two different types of analyses today, which we're going to do both types in this class. One is more of a literary analysis, like how do we view texts from a literary angle. So the way that I teach film, I teach film from the standpoint of a literature professor, right? That's how I like to go about it, because films are literature just as much as a book is, right? So I like to approach film from a literary angle, but I also approach film from a technical angle, which is where we actually break down film and talk about all the film elements. So first thing that I want to accomplish today is maybe just go through let's go through the literary first, and then we'll talk about the technical film part. Okay.
Could I ask a question real quick?
Okay, go right ahead.
Just so like I'm getting this right, that way my head is like mapping this out right. It sounds like it's basically we would be judging it as the technical side of it, like shots and why the director placed this thing here and staging and all that. And then the other side of it is like the story. Is that basically what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to break down all these movies, like what are they about? What are their themes? Like, what was going on in America when the movie's made? What's going on with the characters in the movie, right? All that kind of stuff is where the literature side of things helps us out. But if we're talking about the artistry of the film and the camera and the sound and the angles and the editing, right? That's where we get more to the film side. So we're going to do both in this class as far as how to handle it. If you had someone with more of a straight film background, you might, if you had this class, that might be more of a straight film class, right? But I like to handle it from the perspective of a literature type of class. So let me share my screen for this handout. Ryan gets to hear the same thing he just heard a minute ago, and he gets to hear it twice. So literary schools of thought. Literary schools of thought. I don't know how much experience you guys have with literature. Some of you might have taken English 102 already. Some of you might have had one of the 200 English classes here at Southern. I don't know what all of your backgrounds are, but these are different ways that you can approach a book, but these are also different ways that you can approach a film. Okay, all these different ways. So here are some ways, here's some approaches that you can use to think about movies from a literary angle, right? So the biggest thing that we run a risk of, well, all of us do it, right? All the stuff that I don't care if it's a book or a movie, all the stuff is supposed to be entertaining, right? It's supposed to entertain us. We're supposed to have a good time. Lots of times with media, we're consumers of media, right? We just consume it, we enjoy it, then we go on with our lives. We really don't spend a lot of time thinking about it or the implications of whatever it is we watch or read. So this first part of class today is mostly geared towards, here's some different ways we can think about all these different movies we're going to watch from the perspective of, from a literary perspective. Then the second half will be, here's all these film terms, and here's how we can think about film from that standpoint too. So the first approach that I mentioned here is biographical. Okay, biographical. I mostly talk about authors here. Like, I use this handout for a bunch of different classes. But this approach makes the author the main concern and uses the text to illustrate some argument about the author. So maybe instead of the author in this case, we might say the director, right? Whatever. We know a lot of stuff about the director, right? Or maybe the person who wrote the screenplay of the film might be who we would do our analysis of. But what do we know about this director? And how did that maybe shape his or her construction of whatever is happening in the movie, right? So some of these directors that we're studying, we do know a lot about. Stanley Kubrick is one of them, right? He did the movie we're watching of his is 2001: Space Odyssey. He did a lot of other famous movies too. The Shining is one. Full Metal Jacket is one. Barry Lyndon, Lolita. We know a lot about this guy's life, right? So what was happening in this director's life? Maybe how did it shape his art in this case? So the very first movie we're going to watch next week, Citizen Kane, it has a very famous, one of the most famous directors of all time, Orson Welles, right? So when you might talk, one of the things we'll talk about next week is Welles himself, right? And how did maybe what was happening with his life and his career, how did it shape his construction of this text, Citizen Kane? So yeah, a lot of these movies we will approach from this biographical standpoint of the director. What was going on with the director or with the screenwriter, and how did that shape maybe the construction of the story? So that is one. Another approach here is disability. Okay, this might be something that we talk about. It should definitely be something we'll probably talk about when we get the horror films, right? Disability. But over the past 10 years or so in classes like these, this has become a new sort of trend, a new sort of school of thought for analyzing literature or film. So we might ask ourselves, okay, what is a film doing with talking about the body, right? Especially disabled bodies, right? Do we have some disabled type of character in a film, right? If so, how is that character represented? Right? Is that character represented in a way that maybe showcases stereotypes about the disabled, right? Or is that character being represented in maybe an empowering sort of way? So whenever we talk about something like disability, sometimes we might take for granted that a movie or a book might help give us the attitudes, maybe even the stereotypes that we have about the disabled, right? So this school of thought is almost a very political one, right? It wants to ensure that we read books, and books do put out positive messages about the disabled. I mentioned that this oftentimes happens in horror films because oftentimes stuff happens to these characters' bodies in horror films. Right, we'll watch The Exorcist. We're going to watch The Silence of the Lambs. Right, disability I know will play a part in those two films for sure. Even when we talk about the Babadook, I remember the kid in the Babadook seems to have a type of disability, which makes it hard for the mom to go about her day-to-day life. So if you notice this type of thing happening in a movie, make note of it, right? Ask yourself, what's going on with this? What's going on with this problem? Again, feel free to stop me at any point if I'm not making sense with any of these. But another one is called Ecological Studies. Another word for it is eco-criticism. Eco-criticism is another name for this. But if we're watching a movie and maybe the setting plays in a very important part in one of these movies, right? So for instance, just thinking off the top of my head, one of the first movies we'll watch is The Grapes of Wrath. Right, The Grapes of Wrath, we have two main settings, sort of the Oklahoma Dust Bowl setting as well as the California, right? That's where the movie takes place. Well, what kind of messages are these movies portraying about the environment? Maybe even like how we treat the environment as a civilization, right? How is nature being portrayed? Is nature a dangerous place, right? Is it a place that we can go to and escape from whatever we're dealing with, in society? How is nature being portrayed? Apocalypse Now is about Vietnam, right? So Vietnam as a setting in Apocalypse Now, right? How we treated Vietnam during that war, the way that we sort of like burn it and napalmed it and all that type of stuff, right? That's definitely a key part of that film, as we'll talk about. So if you notice, especially the great outdoors, nature might seem like a character in some of these movies, especially when we talk about Westerns, right? The West is a character in almost every Western you'll watch, right? There's different types of even portrayals of the West. Sometimes you get these more desert-like settings. Sometimes they show the Rocky Mountains, right? But no matter what, in a Western, you can always sort of be assured that the environment is a character of some sorts. So what's going on with the environment, especially in Westerns, right? That'll be something that we'll talk about. So if you notice nature, ask yourself, what's going on with it? What's this director trying to do? What kind of message is this movie trying to put out? Formal studies, I'm going to kind of skip over this one for now, because that's what we're going to be talking about with film analysis. If we were talking about literature, we might talk about stuff like symbols and word choice and paragraphing and things like that. When a film, the formal aspects of a film are the way it's shot, the way it's directed, the way it's lit, right? So we'll talk about that part of film in a second. So I'm skipping over this one for now, because that's the focus of part 2 of what we're going to be doing today. This next approach for approaching literature, it's gender and race, approaching literature from the perspective of gender and race. Okay, so whenever we talk about gender, this entails a bunch of different things. One school of thought is feminist criticism, right? Feminist criticism. So what's going on with female characters in movies, right? Are they portraying age-old stereotypes about women, right? Are the women, what's going on with women oftentimes in these films? One, again, I'm thinking about some of the movies we're going to watch. One movie we're going to watch is The Silence of the Lambs, right? It's about a woman who's sort of entering a male world, right? It's about a female FBI agent getting her start, right? So part of that movie is about this woman, Clarice, trying to fit into sort of a male-dominated world, right? The FBI. So this is something that might come into play. I know it's going to come into play next week whenever we talk about the Grapes of Wrath, because the character of Ma Jode is a very sort of influential woman character in early film. So we will talk about her. So we're going to get the Feminist Approaches the film really quick. Sometimes in movies, I don't know, I'm sure it'll come up at some point. Sometimes in movies we talk about sexuality too, right? Especially how is sexuality represented in film? You know, what type of attitudes about sexuality are being portrayed in film? Well, lots of times in these very early films that we'll watch, as we'll talk about, I'll talk more about this in a minute when we talk about film. But oftentimes, sexuality might be sort of under the surface, right? Especially in the 40s and 50s, right? It's there, it's part of film, but oftentimes they don't quite spell it out for you, right? Lots of times today they'll have sex scenes in films and all this type of stuff, right? Back then they really didn't spell it out for you quite in the same way. That doesn't mean it's not there, but they just didn't throw it in your face oftentimes like they do today. But sometimes whenever we talk about sexuality, whenever we talk about literature and film, sometimes there might be something under the surface that isn't even heterosexual, right? Lots of times there's discourses in these movies. Maybe these characters are gay, right? Maybe there's something else going on. If you notice something like that happening in one of these texts, think about it, because this is called, in literary studies, this is called queer theory, right? That the reason why it's called that is the people who write these kinds of papers, you know, they like to take, of course, you guys know the word queer is often used in a negative light towards gay people, right? So they try to take that term and sort of make it empowering in a way. But if you notice something going on with sexuality, it might not be gay, right? It might be something else, right? But if you notice something happening with sexuality, oftentimes that might not be straight sexuality, heterosexuality. Think about it. Ask yourself what's happening. It might be something as simple as a character flirting with another character, right? But that might have some type of meaning as far as like, how do we approach this character? So again, oftentimes this stuff's not always in your face, but it's sometimes there. And race, of course, is a prominent theme, oftentimes in lit and film. You know, what types of portrayals of different types of races come up, right? So whenever we talk about a Vietnam movie, right, how are the Vietnamese portrayed? Right? If we talk about, I'll have to look at my list of films again. But race might come up, right? Maybe race is a theme in some of these films. So I know for a fact it is when we talk about Westerns. We'll talk a lot about Native Americans, right? How were Native Americans portrayed in Westerns, right? So yeah, that is going to be a big part of our class. If you notice something happening with race, there's an idea when we talk about race isn't always the color of your skin, All right, race is oftentimes a construction that society puts on you. Whenever we talk about the film The Searchers, as you'll see, there's going to be a great scene in it where where a child who was captured, a white child who was captured by Native Americans, acts Native American, right? And John Wayne kind of looks at this character in disgust and says, she's not white anymore, right? So this kind of idea goes to show you that race isn't always skin deep, right? It's oftentimes something that we construct as a society. So this will be something that we'll talk about periodically in the class too when it comes up. Race. I know for a fact a couple of these films, especially The Searchers, deals with this idea of race. And sometimes, like The Searchers was made in 1956, right? Sometimes race was very prominent in America at that time, right? That was when we were right before the civil rights movement, right? So if you notice something happening there, pay attention to it. It might be something worth bringing to the table in discussion. I'm going over all these things too, guys, because this will help you bring things to the table for our discussions. So you might notice something like this, but other people might not, right? So this is how we all learn from each other. If you can kind of pick up on these patterns, what I'm talking about. This next one is influence studies. Influence study, you might ask yourself, what's the relationship between texts? So this is something that plays a big part in film. You might ask yourself, how did one director's style maybe influence another director's style? And directors imitate other directors, from the past, or make nods to them, right? In the way that even the movie is shot. So, for instance, whenever we talk about Westerns, you might say, how did John Ford's Westerns maybe influence Sergio Leone's Italian Westerns, right? How did one film influence another? If you do a type of analysis like that, the only danger you run into is, can you really prove that the director watched this other movie, right? Oftentimes you can prove that, right? Because sometimes the director will say something in an interview or something to that effect. But yeah, this will be stuff we talk about as the semester goes on. We'll talk a lot about a lot of these early directors. Then we'll talk about, okay, did this director influence this director? That'll be something we discuss, especially since we're talking about genres in this class, especially within genres. You can probably rest assured later directors have probably seen a lot of the movies that these early directors did, right? So influence is oftentimes there whenever we're talking about something like the Western or sci-fi or horror, right? Comedy even. So these are connections you might make as the semester goes on. The more movies we watch, the more connections between these films you'll notice. Psychological approaches to literature and film. I'll just ask you guys this. How many of you have had psychology classes maybe here at Southern? I see, let's see, I'll go back to the view here. I saw somebody raise their hand. It's kind of hard to see when I'm sharing my screen like this.
It was me, Crystal.
Crystal. Yeah, so Crystal, you said you've had some psych courses. Some of the rest of you had them here, I'm guessing. Bill, you said you have. Yeah, if you're interested in psychology, oftentimes you can break down characters in these movies using a psychological lens. Some of these like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's a movie about psychiatry, right? But oftentimes, whenever we're talking about psychology from this standpoint, we'll often use these old theorists. So oftentimes with literature and film, we might be doing more psychiatry instead of psychology per se. But we might try to break down what's going on with the character, right? What maybe caused the character's trauma, right? Can we kind of break it down? Why does the character this way? What caused the character to act in a certain way? So oftentimes we can play psychiatrist in a class like this and maybe use our psychological toolbox to maybe break down what's happening with a character in any given film. Oftentimes, the psychiatrist Sigmund Freud is often used in classes like this. Crystal, Bill, do you guys remember, did you guys talk about Sigmund Freud in any of your psychology classes? Yeah, just I'm seeing a yes here. Yeah, that rings a bell.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's prominent, matter of fact.
Right. Yeah, Sigmund Freud's sort of invented the field of psychiatry, right? He talks about, you know, what causes a person to act in certain ways. Well, oftentimes it deals with their traumas, right? He mostly talks about male children, but he says his argument is, I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'll just give you a little bit of a preview. If you want to read more about it later, feel free. But Freud argues that male children, especially when they're babies, have a desire for their mother, right? He takes this idea from an old Greek play called Oedipus the King. Well, he says the very first traumatic moment of a male child's life is when he realizes that that's taboo, right? You can't be in love with your mother in that way. And that is the first traumatic moment of a kid's life. And it's all downhill from there, right? Yeah, that all causes us to be messed up people, right?
Yeah, and it seems like that's evolved through the years, even in film.
Right.
That thought or that challenge has been evolving as we've watched these films through the years.
Yeah, it's a shame that we're not reading Psycho, because Psycho is all about that almost. Norman Bates and his mother. Right. It's a shame. It's a shame I trimmed that one off the list this semester. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes, I mean, you can always kind of ask yourself, what type of traumas did maybe this character undergo? Why does this make this character act that way? Right. So we can kind of play psychiatrist oftentimes in film. Characters are part of what makes film great. We have this semester we're going to view many different types of iconic characters, right? Very iconic performances. Most of these movies we're watching have won Oscars, right? So, you know, lots of these characters are troubled in some way. So you can always ask yourself, what makes this character tick? If you ask yourself those types of questions, you're viewing literature from a psychological perspective. And the last one I want to talk about before moving to film terms is social, political, cultural. This is pretty much viewing film from the perspective of history, right? What was going on in America whenever this film was made? How did that maybe shape maybe the tone of the film, right? Maybe a film might seem very pessimistic or something, right? Maybe a film might seem optimistic. if we watch an early Westerns, oftentimes, lots of times those early Westerns are very optimistic because America, people were feeling great about America in the 50s, right? But if let's say we watch something from the 1974, right, that might be different because people were feeling a little more pessimistic after the Vietnam War. So at any given point, you might ask yourself, what was happening in America? How did that maybe shape the art that is this movie? Some of these movies that we'll talk about are very recent, the past 10 years, right? So some of these movies will have some recency to them. Some of the movies, like The Grapes of Wrath, right? That's a movie's very directly about something that was happening in the 30s and 40s. Whatever is happening in America at any given moment, definitely you can argue probably shapes these films in some way. How could we come out with a horror film like The Exorcist in 1974, right? The Vietnam War had something to do with that, right? That war changed a lot of things about the film industry. Things that people could get away with that they couldn't get away with before. So these are some different ways to approach stories in films, characters in films, plot. These are ways that you can look at plot. So this is almost like literature 101 in 30 minutes, right? These are different ways that you can approach texts and think about them and analyze them. So I'm mostly just trying to give you guys a toolbox that you can use to approach all this stuff. Okay. So the next thing we'll do then, I'll type up I'll share a whiteboard here. See if I can type in it. I might have to use Word instead of this. Yeah, this will work. Now we're moving on to film terms, film analysis terms. So the way that I want you to think about these film terms is this. So it's almost like economics. There's macro level and micro level, right? Macro level is kind of what I just finished talking about. That's when we're talking about the story, the themes, the plot, the characters. That's the big stuff. Whenever we're talking about these film terms, this is the micro analysis of film, right? This is where we're talking about directing, acting, colors, lighting. In the medium that is film, that is what makes the film the art that it is, right? Literature has its own set of rules. Film has its own set of rules, right? So a lot of the way that these films are constructed then make it the art that it is. So not only are we talking, a film might have a good story to it, but it might be crappily made, right? And then we don't talk about it. So here are some terms that we can use. This is a vocabulary that we can use to talk about film. These are things to notice while you're watching film. Okay. So the first, I don't know if you guys got a chance to read through that PDF that I told you about, the writing about film from Blackboard. But if you haven't gotten a chance to look at that yet, definitely do so after this discussion, because it will reinforce what I just say, what I'm getting ready to talk about. Okay. But the big term, lots of times whenever I talk about film, they're French terms too, because the French are the ones who helped invent film analysis. But the first term is called mise en scene. Mise en scene. So whenever you're watching a film, mise en scene is everything that's in the scene, everything that's in any given scene. So you kind of always have to ask yourself, what's going on in a scene? You know, you can always ask yourself, the director probably meant for everything that's on the image to be in the scene. So whenever we talk about mise en scene, there's lots of different elements that go into this. Mise en scene is kind of the big word for a lot of different stuff. Okay. So one thing that we might focus in with mise en scene is props. What types of props are in a scene, right? How are the props maybe significant? What's going on with costumes, right? What's going on with costumes in a scene? Whatever a character is wearing might be important in some type of way. Right? How a character's dressed, how does that character's dress maybe add to the portrayal of the character? Like in a Western, right? In a Western, the good guy is probably dressed in white, and the bad guy is probably dressed in black, right? The trick is old as man there, right? The way that characters are dressed might signify something about their temperament, maybe. How was a scene lit? Oftentimes lighting in these movies might even depend on the genre that we're acting in, right? Horror films are oftentimes very dimly lit, right? Oftentimes you don't really see bright happy looking horror movies, right? You don't see a lot of color in horror movies. I'll say lighting / color here. Lighting and color are two different things, but they're kind of related, right? Lighting and color. So compare that to, let's say, a comedy, right? Comedies are very oftentimes brightly lit, right? You might have a wide color palette in a comedy, right? Lots of bright colors. You might see lots of oranges, yellows, purples, right? Things that you wouldn't oftentimes see in maybe a horror film, right? Because they're, as you'll see, these are those are very different types of genres. Musicals, we're not talking about musicals any, but musicals are oftentimes a very bright, colorful genre, right? They're very brightly lit. They got lots of the musicals have wide color palettes. Compare that to horror, right? Which is very dimly lit. Or maybe westerns, right? Westerns often have this very brownish sort of color to them, right? Just because of the dust in the west and the deserts and things like that. So lighting, color, these are all things to think about, especially in these early films we're watching. You know, if we're watching a film in black and white, as most of these early films we're going to watch in this class are. I know we're doing Citizen Kane, Grapes of Wrath, and Casablanca in the first couple of weeks. All of those films were made in black and white. So without the benefit of color, you know, how does the director, you know, portray the mise en scene, right? How does the director showcase the art? Well, oftentimes these very early films do lots of fancy tricks with lighting, right? How are certain scenes lit? Whenever you watch Citizen Kane next week, look out for the lighting in that movie, especially. Right? There's some beautiful images in Citizen Kane of just like light shining through the windows, right? Just because he designed the lighting in that scene to achieve a certain purpose. So especially in black and white films, look out for lighting, because it's usually if you notice something with lighting in a black and white film, usually it's done for a specific purpose because the color isn't there. Right? Not to say that directors who shoot in color don't often do interesting things with lighting too. And I'm just saying, especially in black and white, think about lighting, because oftentimes that's the only tool at the director's disposal. I don't know if you guys know about this, but a lot of these films that we're watching, like Casablanca, back in the Bill, you might know. Bill, have you ever watched a lot of the Turner Classic Movies channel?
Yes, I absolutely love those too.
Right.
And you get a lot of input from those hosts. I was going to ask a question, if it was okay, about the lighting here. I noticed that in Silence of the Lambs, in the one scene for when Agent Starling is in the house and it gets real dark, and matter of fact, he has these, infrared glasses on. That is such a chilling scene to me. And before that, a lot of that movie, and I never noticed this till I read the pamphlet you sent us, was that it's kind of dark. That movie's kind of dim, like it's, when it shows even West Virginia on it. Yeah. So I don't think that I'll ever watch a movie again like I used to since I read about this, what you're talking about now.
Right. Yeah. Those of it. We'll talk more about that when we get to the movie for sure. But that you're exactly right. That scene with the infrared goggles, it is chilling, right? Because it shows her helplessness there, right? She's in a completely pitch black environment, right? She's at his mercy there because he is wearing those, right? So, and you're pointing out the dim lighting in West Virginia and stuff, right? That's all part of the horror movie genre, right? But I mentioned here the Turner Classic Movies channel because we owe a lot to Ted Turner, right, for preserving a lot of these old movies. Right, Ted Turner, like if all the billionaires in America, Ted Turner has probably done more for this type of stuff than anyone. Right, but one of Ted Turner's cardinal sins when he made this Turner Classic Movies channel was trying to put some of these old black and white movies into color. If you watch Casablanca in color versus watching it in black and white, it's a totally different film, right? Totally different. The black and white is how that movie was meant to be shown, right? So, yeah, there's lots of cases like that where they tried to colorize old black and white movies and it just doesn't work, right? Sometimes directors might have chosen the film in black and white instead of color, right? Especially if we're talking about the 50s through the 70s. Right? Sometimes directors had a choice. Sometimes they decided to do things in black and white instead. So watching movies in black and white, you guys will get to watch several this semester for sure. So lighting, color, all these are parts of mise-en-scene. Acting is part of mise-en-scene, right? Just because the actor's performance plays some type of role in how you interpret the character, right? Sometimes this will be something we'll talk about periodically, but some actors have reputations, right, for playing certain types of characters. We're going to watch 2 Jack Nicholson movies, Chinatown and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Jack Nicholson's one of the greatest actors ever, right? But lots of times people say Jack Nicholson always plays Jack Nicholson, right? He doesn't even play characters. He plays himself and all in these characters. Like that's oftentimes something what people say about his performances. Right. So we're gonna watch movies with some of the most iconic actors, actresses ever, right? We're gonna watch movies, we're gonna watch a John Wayne film. John Wayne's an American icon, right? We're gonna watch so we're gonna watch movies from John Wayne. Henry Fonda is a very famous American actor, right? Because you guys might know his daughter Jane Fonda, right? So we're going to watch some of the most iconic actors, actresses who've ever been on the screen, right? All these, the way that what we know about the rest of their movies, how do they portray these characters, right? What type of acting style do they have, right? So oftentimes, whenever we talk about these films, we'll talk about a certain person's performance. What did you think about their performance? If it was another actor, how would the character be different? Right. So we'll oftentimes have this type of discussion in this class too. What's going on with the acting in any given movie? Sometimes even directors prefer certain actors. That's something else as well. Like whenever we talk about Once Upon a Time in the West, that's the only Western, unfortunately, that Clint Eastwood was not in with Sergio Leone, right? Because those two were a partnership. They did 3 great Westerns together, right? So oftentimes great directors work well with certain actors or actresses.
Like Jon Favreau uses Vince Vaughn a lot. So,
Right.
man, I know we're not discussing them, but just as a for instance, maybe for the younger generation out here to know what we're talking about. But yeah, I totally get that. I see that a lot whenever there's certain actors that are together a lot in movies, or a director using a certain actor as their lead or their supporting.
I know there was a span of about 4 or 5 years where anytime Mark Wahlberg was in a movie, I will guarantee you the director was a guy named Peter Berg. They worked together on like 5 different films in a span of 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
I always pay attention to who directs something because I'm a movie fanatic anyway, and a TV head. But I look at the things that we're talking about, but it's normally after I watch the movie or the show or whatever it is more than once. Like the first time that I watch it, I feel like I just get an overview of what it's about and just on the surface. But then the more you watch something, the more in depth that you can get on looking and paying attention to the scene, that everyone's clothes kind of matches. You don't have they're not identical outfits by any means, but you don't have somebody with black on, or well, black's not a good color, but like orange on and somebody with pink on right beside of them. They kind of blend well together so that it's easier to look at, and just how different scenes are made up like that, I pay attention to.
Right. Any of you guys in here like Quentin Tarantino, the director?
I've only seen like 3 movies, but I haven't seen a movie by him that I didn't like.
Yeah, I bring him up here because he's another modern example of a director who has certain actors he likes to use. Right, Leonardo Dicaprio has become one of his most
Samuel L. Jackson is one.
Samuel L. Jackson's in a lot of his movies, right? Almost all of them. So Michael Madsen, he's in a lot of Tarantino's movies. What's the actress's name from Kill Bill?
Thurman?
Uma Thurman, right? Uma Thurman's in a lot of his movies. So he has his picks for his movies too. There's also the guy from Inglourious Bastards and Django. That's another one of his guys. I'll say here, acting, oftentimes the relationship with the director. So that's most of what's happening with mise-en-scene. Okay, these are things to always think about in a scene. How is a scene constructed? Well, another thing you always kind of have to pay attention to is the camera. What's going on with the camera in any given scene? So there's lots of different types of angles that the camera might be doing. And oftentimes these angles have almost these universal type of meanings to them. However, a scene is shot with a camera oftentimes has something to do with how we should view the scene. The handout talks about this, but a high angle shot, oftentimes high angle shots are oftentimes filmed on a crane. You have this big crane, right, that goes way up in the air, and the camera is on the crane looking down. Right, but the high angle shots do that. They sort of look down on whatever's happening. It's this big open view. Oftentimes too, now they do helicopter shots, right? They'll sometimes film scenes with helicopters in a lot of modern movies. These are called high angle shots. Oftentimes you get this broad, it's almost like, not to get religious here, right? But it's almost like you're God looking down on the action, right? That's kind of what a high angle shot is. So you're meant to look at characters in a high angle shot from this sort of broad point of view, right? You're looking down on them almost like they're ants, right? That's kind of what a high angle shot is. You're looking, it's up and you're looking down on the action. I challenge you for our first class next week on Citizen Kane. There's a very famous shot in high angle shot in Citizen Kane. See if you can identify it when you're watching it. That might be like the first thing I ask you next week. What's the great high angle shot in Citizen Kane? You'll know it when you see it. But that's looking down on the action, right? There's the middle angle shot. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but if you ever watch something like a sitcom, right? If you watch a sitcom, it's very rare you ever see the actor's entire body, right? Most of the time, characters are filmed from their waist up, right? That's called a middle angle shot, right? Oftentimes these are neutral, right? If you have a middle angle shot, it takes a neutral tone, right? Oftentimes the director is not trying to make a point if you're just filming a character from the waist up. Right? Like I said, oftentimes even when you're watching TV, you watch a sitcom or something, pay attention. It's very rare you ever see somebody's entire body. Most of the time they're filmed from the waist up. And then you have the low angle. Typing's all messed up. That's when the camera is sort of down on the ground looking up at the character, right, or the action. Oftentimes that is used to show the importance of a character, right, or the power that a character might have, right? Oftentimes when these characters are on scene, the camera gives us a nice sort of perspective on who's the powerful character here, right? Power dynamics are always at play. Who's the powerful character? Who's the passive character here, right? The way that the camera shows this shows how larger than life some of these characters are. That oftentimes gives us a gauge as far as viewing these characters. All right, so if it's a high angle shot, it's diminishing the importance of the characters. It's a low angle shot looking up, it's probably showing the importance of the character. middle angle from the waist up, it's kind of neutral, right? That it kind of takes more of a neutral tone. So always sort of pay attention to where the camera is in any given scene. There's also other types of shots too that the camera might take. There's the famous close-up, right? If the director really wants you to pay attention to whatever emotional thing the character is going through, oftentimes they'll get really close up to the face, right? Where you can almost kind of see the sweat pores on somebody's face, right? The close-up is a type of shot. It's oftentimes used to build tension, right? Or used to illustrate a certain point. Several directors in this class loved close-ups, as we shall see. Probably the first one we'll see a lot of them is probably One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There's lots of close-ups in that film. So always pay attention. If you notice close-ups, they're probably there for a reason. And then there's the tracking shot. Tracking shots are where the camera follows the actor. So maybe an actor's walking up the street, right? The camera follows the actor. Camera tracks the actor's movement, right? That's called a tracking shot. Oftentimes there might, I don't know if, it's a shame. Did any of you guys see the movie? It just came out a year or two ago, 1917. Any of you see the movie 1917 that came out?
Yes.
You know, that part of it. Or say that again.
It's all filmed to be one shot,
Right.
basically. It's
Yeah.
just one long tracking shot. My bad. But it's like an hour and a half long, just following the characters. No cuts.
Yeah, it's an awesome film because it is done that way, right? Just one long tracking shot. One thing we're going to talk about in a second is editing, how a movie's edited, right? Oftentimes the editing is important. It gives us transitions. It gives us room to breathe. Well, in that movie 1917, you don't get that. It follows the characters on like this 20-mile journey from one point A to point B, right? It never gives us a break. So, you know, that's
makes you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It makes you feel like you're a part of them. Like it makes you feel like you're one of them going on this journey. Like it really humanizes them. You don't feel like you're watching them do something. You feel like you're with them doing it.
Right. It's very personal, like, right? It's not like watching a documentary, right? It's just more neutral, right? You're invested with them by following them, right? Yeah, that's a movie I would recommend to any of you. It's a great World War I movie. Right? You get lots of good World War II movies, but not many good World War I ones. Check that movie out. I kind of got to wrap. We only got 15 more minutes. So I kind of got to speed up a little to get the rest of these. Editing. Editing is how transitions work in films. So always sort of pay attention to how we get from one scene to another. Right? We just talked about 1917 where there's no editing. Right, so it's just it is edited, but you just don't see it, right? But how do we get from one scene to the next? So oftentimes there's lots of nice little you can just even like watch a PowerPoint slideshow and you can kind of see how movies are edited too, right? One type of edit is the fade out. Right, so the scene ends and it's almost like the screen sort of fades to black, right? That's oftentimes how movies end, right? The screen will fade to black and it'll say the end.
I'm going to tell my age here, but years ago when we took a lot of home movies, they come up with this feature where you could slowly fade out and darken the picture. And in our elementary way, we were editing and didn't really know it.
Right.
And now that when we look back on those, we saw what mistakes we made. Yeah, we do it too much or not enough, or the camera and all that is such an important part.
Yeah, very, very much so. Oftentimes you'll see like these types of student made films like you're just talking about, right? Sometimes they do interesting stuff with even simple technology. One of the greatest horror films ever is called The Evil Dead. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen The Evil Dead, but it's one of the best horror films ever made. But it was just a bunch of college kids getting together. And that's who made The Evil Dead. And he later became Sam Raimi, who later went on to direct the Spider-Man movies. Right, he made quite a career for himself. Just a student project, just a bunch of college kids getting together to make a film, became a sensation. Now, something else we'll talk about sometimes in this class too, by the way, is the economics of film. That's something I haven't mentioned much yet, but how do films get greenlit, right? How do they get funding? Sometimes these are independent movies that studios don't endorse, right? How much money did a movie make? Is that significant? Did a movie flop at the box office and not make any money, right? So the money making aspect of movies is something we're going to talk about a lot too, because a lot of these movies we're going to watch were busts that didn't make hardly anything, but later became cult classics. But just to get back to the point at hand, the fade out is one type of edit. Lots of times the camera will wipe. It's like it'll kind of wipe, right? It'll instead of just fading, it'll wipe from one image to another. So that's another type of edit. Sometimes the camera will dissolve. Right? It'll dissolve almost like mist, and then another scene will start. Lots of times too, an object might link two scenes together. Right? And objects will sometimes link two scenes. So maybe like, let's say a scene ends showing a bird, right? And the next scene might start showing a bird, right? So that's what I mean by objects. Sometimes films are connected together in that way, where it focuses on a certain object and or a prop maybe, and then dissolved into the next prop, which is the same thing. So oftentimes films are edited together in that way. Just to give you one funny example here, I don't know if how many really old movies some of you guys have watched, but I talked about sex in films, right? If really old films, they couldn't have sex scenes. So oftentimes the way these were edited would be like if it was implied that two characters were doing that, it would show a train driving through a tunnel, right? Right. You can kind of see the obvious symbolism here, right? So that was an editing trick that was oftentimes used to spell out what was happening in a lot of old movies. So edits, not only how the camera's working, but how do we get from one scene to another? Pay attention to that. There's another, again, with Citizen Kane, there's there will be one transition I can tell you that will catch you off guard. And of course, the soundtrack. Right? I don't know how much more I can space down here. I'll just put it here. The soundtrack. Soundtrack is vital to movies. Some of these directors are extremely reliant on the soundtrack. There's a great YouTube video. If you guys are on YouTube later, look at Star Wars without sound. Right, you'll find a scene from the very first Star Wars that'll show you how awkward it is without sound. It's the scene from the very end. It's like at the very end of Star Wars when Princess Leia and Han Solo and Luke Skywalker are all just standing together and they're getting awards or something, right? Watch how awkward that is without sound. And it will go to show you how important sound is to a movie. Sometimes with sound, you have the soundtrack and the score, right? The composer of the soundtrack of a movie is an extremely important element, right? What's the score like? Does the score take over the movie? Is the score sort of subtle? Do you hardly notice the music, but the music's there, right? Always pay attention to the score and the soundtrack. What type of mood is the score giving us? Sometimes it's scores from the composer, right? Sometimes though, the soundtrack might just have natural sounds, right? Sometimes just purely natural sounds are important. Birds chirping outside, right? Horror films oftentimes like to set it up that you will get no sound and then boom, it'll give you a big loud jump scare, right? That's how soundtracks work as far as creating an atmosphere in a movie. Just different noises you hear, cars starting, so always pay attention to the sound, right? What's the sound doing? Sound is probably, of all these elements, sound is probably one of the most important. Maybe a director picks a song, right? Maybe it picks a song. That's an intentional choice. Right? Why did the director pick that particular song? That might not, the composer might not have done. Just another song from, how directors will put songs in movies that aren't from the composer. So always ask yourself, what's the role of the soundtrack? You can probably always guess that almost all these films we're going to watch, I'll always ask you, what's the role of the soundtrack in this one? All right, so that's going to be something to always think about as you're watching through these films. Sometimes it has a minimal role. Sometimes we'll probably hardly talk about it. Sometimes that might be all we talk about because it's so important to the movie. So that's some basic film terms in a nutshell to help you get started. Like I said, if you haven't looked at that PDF yet, that handout I gave, look at it because it'll reinforce some of what I just said. So our first movie next week is Citizen Kane from Orson Welles. It's oftentimes called the best movie ever made, right? Lots of if you go to film school, that's usually one of the first movies you watch. Lots of people think it is, lots of people think it isn't. I'll be interested to hear what you guys have to say. We're starting with one of the most famous films ever. But it's about a media mogul, like a Ted Turner type of character, right, from the 40s. So you can find the movie on HBO Max if you have that service. It is on HBO Max. So if you do have that streaming service, you can find it there. If not, probably rent it on Amazon or something. So again, we're starting with one of the most iconic films ever on day one. So I will be interested to hear what you guys have to say about it. So characters, very important to that movie. Pay attention to the psychology in the movie, because this one character, this whole movie is the study of this one guy almost. Pay attention to camera, sound, editing. He uses lots of tricks from this toolbox that I just told you about to create this movie. So I will look forward to discussing it with all of you. Okay. Thank you guys for being patient. Like I said, this is one of the few days I will talk most of the time. Most of the time it'll be all of you talking. So I will look forward to our first discussion next week. All right.
Is that discussion going to be Tuesday or Thursday?
That'll be Tuesday.
Okay.
Well, I think The Grapes of Wrath, those are in the movie for next Thursday. So those will be the two we watch first. Citizen Kane and Grapes of Wrath. All right. So I will also post some discussion questions up for you on Blackboard. So you can post like whatever you're interested in about the movie before class, just a paragraph or so. That'll even give me a gauge as far as what you guys are interested in talking about before the class. So that'll help me prepare. All right. So I'll post those up for you too. So till next time, guys, take care. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the film.
Have a good weekend.
Yep. Have a good weekend.
Thanks. See you
And
guys
thanks a
Tuesday.
lot.
See you later.